We can't hear you, sir.
Hi, Nutan.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, sir.
Hi, how are you?
Sir, should we start?
Yeah.
Sir, we are waiting for Deeptha ma'am and then we should start.
Hello.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
So I think we should start now. Hello, everyone. So I'm Nutan Vaishnavi.
Am I audible now?
You may just mute the rest. The host can mute the rest of the people who are not speaking. And can
Yes, we've done that. Nutan, you can proceed.
Okay. So I'm Nutan Vaishnavi, welcoming you all on the 9th annual session of Creative Theory Colloquium organized by Creative Theory Association. We are gathered here for the panel discussion on cinema, contemporary churning and future possibilities, chaired by Dr. Deeptha Achar, Faculty, Department of English, Maharaja Sayajirao University, Vadodara. And the speakers of this panel are Professor A. Madhav Prasad, Faculty, Department of Cultural Studies, English and Foreign Languages, University, Hyderabad. Professor Sanjiv Kumar HM, Faculty, Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. Dr. Uma Maheshwari Bhugubanda, Faculty, Department of Cultural Studies, English and Foreign Languages, University, Hyderabad. And Dr. Saeed Haider, Faculty, School of Media and American Studies, University of East Anglia, UK. This panel is coordinated by Dr. Dhananjay Rai, Visiting Fellow CSTS and Faculty of Central University of Gujarat, Gandhinagar. I would like to request Dhananjay sir to introduce us all with the theme of this panel.
Am I audible?
Yes,
no?
sir. Yes.
Okay. I welcome Professor Deeptha Achar, Professor Madhav Prasad, Professor Sanjiv Kumar, Professor Uma Maheshwari, and Professor Syed Ayar. And this is a very interesting and very important session of on creative theory, and the panel on cinema, contemporary churning and future possibilities explores a slew of contemporary churning and the possible direction of Indian cinema. The theme of Creative Theory Colloquium 2022 is Future of Thinking, Crisis and Possibility. Against this backdrop, it becomes imperative to reflect and explore churning in Indian cinema regarding contemporary development. It also becomes crucial to map out the response in the form of challenge, alternative, co-option. The deliberation of the panel becomes extremely crucial when the relationship among cinema, politics, and capital in India is not openly celebrated, but also asked to cultivate, circulate the definite meaning and spectacle. Over to you, Professor Deeptha Achar.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Dhananjay and Nutan, for inviting me to chair what promises to be a very engaging and important session. And all the more so because I think we are at that point where some of the crucial questions that we are faced with in India is actually being played out in the realm of the digital, the filmic, and to rethink the cinematic at this particular juncture seems to be a really significant and important task. This is, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the whole question of the visual turn, but the visual turn has taken new directions with the particular intersections that are coming to be between newer forms of social media such as Instagram and TikTok. The way the cinematic feeds into social media in particular, and how these discourses further feed into setting up a whole range of narratives is something that we need to kind of think about and figure out quite quickly before before it overwhelms us, so to say. So I look forward very much to the different presentations, possibly coming from a wide range of positions, offering different orientation to the question of the cinematic narrative. So on that note, shall I request our first speaker, that is Professor Madhav Prasad, to begin. To introduce him only very briefly, he's one of the among the earliest theorists of the filmic in post-independence India, and his book, of course, on the ideology and the Hindi film is compulsory reading for those who want to study the area. So on that note, I would, of course, that is not to this is not an exhaustive introduction, but I think he would be really he would be an appropriate thinker to begin this panel discussion. So on that note, I request Professor Madhav Prasad to begin.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Deepta. So yeah, in the theme, is something that in any case some of us had been, including my colleague Uma, who's here, working on for some time. So it's a pleasure to share some of that with this audience. My talk today will focus on the specific case of what has widely been sort of discussed as the new cinema, the new cinemas of India. In many languages, we are aware. I think it's just too visible to pass notice. So the question that rises for me is, so one of the ways in which people have welcomed this new phenomenon is to say, after a long, after the 70s, when there was certain good cinema being made, there was a sort of falling off of that trend. It has sort of died down, and now a new round of good cinema making has begun. So it becomes a sort of, good cinema, bad cinema type of distinction which operates. to basically set the tone for welcoming to discussing and liking or disliking the films that we one of the problems with that is that once if you make this kind of distinction, then there's always this danger that you go to what you think is a good film and then it turns out to be not so good. Then your sort of distinction is all sort of collapses. Similarly, you go to a popular commercial film and it turns out to be pretty good. And all of either of these scenarios immediately leads to a confusion. So I think the question of what is good and what is bad is really a very contingent question. It really depends on each and every film. You take a film and you see whether what may be good about it. So I'm not saying there should be no such judgment, but that judgment cannot be sort of applied to broad categories of films. They have this judgment has to be individualized for each film. So instead, my approach would be to try and understand this change that is going on now. This new development in relation to the socio-economic processes that we are also witnessing. So, I mean, it's one thing that I think is an important way of approaching any aesthetic questions is to relate them to the larger social ground in which they emerge. So in that spirit, what I'm going to do is to try and elaborate what I think is a relation between the last, say, 30 years of full-scale capitalist economy, economic growth, economic, the structures, transformation of structures into full-scale capitalism, and the social change that has come about as a result of that, and and to ground this new aesthetic in that change in the society. Now, I want to say a few words. So what I will do, I think we are all familiar with these films, and my purpose will be to rather set the framework for appreciating these films, to understand what's going on in these films better, right? So I will largely concentrate on, laying out this question of the capitalism and aesthetic change. And I may refer to one or two films in the process. And if time permits, we may come back to discussing a particular films. I have that also as a possibility. But even if we don't get to that point, I think I'm really interested in saying that we need to understand the current sort of explosion of a particular kind of cinema in relation to these processes. And I will try to show how actually this works in my understanding. So to begin with, to go back in time a little bit. So we have a cinema aesthetic which has lasted for many decades, and which lately acquired the name called Bollywood. Before it used to be known as Hindi cinema, Bombay cinema, etc. And by and large, what you see there is a particular type of combination of aesthetic elements, narratives, spectacle, and various types of insertions like comedy scenes, etc. Where a certain types of moral tales were told with a certain sort of leeway for the so the indulgence in the pleasures of the modern, right? And we used to think of this, it's economists will call it the mixed economy sort of phase of our independent existence. And while mixed economy tends to be understood sometimes as a combination of capitalist and socialist elements, I think the more perhaps the preferred definition for me is that it's a combination of formal and informal, and the farther back you go, the less the smaller the formal sector is vis-a-vis the last economy as a whole. So in other words, when you take this formal informal as the distinction, you also realize that the informal, the predominance of the informal is also an indication of the relative stagnation of social relations, while economic production has moved into capitalist mode, right? So in other words, we have had a capitalist economy to some extent for a long time, but not a capitalist society. And it's only when you have a capitalist society that you can say that capitalism has truly arrived. As we all know, capitalist production, production for capitalism can take place in a slave economy like the American South and so on. So there's an automatic sort of process of that wherever capitalist industry is found, their social relations will automatically change and become like the capitalist social relations of, say, the industrialized countries. So that's what we've had. But since the 90s, we know the history of that. There has been a concerted move on the part, policy moves on the part of the Indian governments, various governments, to move us into a properly capitalist economy, which means that globalization, which opened up the economy to foreign capital on a large scale, privatization, that is shedding various assets, that the public sector assets, selling them off, and liberalization, that is making receptive, making a friendly atmosphere, creating a friendly atmosphere for the functioning of capital, right? Now, in such a situation, in the previous situation, one of the things that we noticed is that in our country, we've had trade unions. Of course, there are many, each political party has its own trade union, and some are bigger than others. But effectively, most people, because of the formal-informal imbalance, most people have operated through non-modern collectives, in their relation to the state, to the larger national, space. Their relations have been mediated by non-modern, that is non-capitalist, collectives, such as castes, communities of various kinds. They may not be only castes and communities of the older, kind. They may also be newly formed, but they are not modern collectives of the kind that, say, a trade union is. So the mediation of individual relations to the larger entity is, by the trade union, is a very small, used to be a very small sector. Now, within that same structure, what's happened is today the economy has opened up, and more people have been drawn into this economy in various ways. And we have seen, the call center craze, the IT sectors, in the various types of work opportunities for people in a kind of middle class, lower middle class, and working class origins. In the malls and in the shops, wherever you go, you have these new types of workers, right? The security people and so on a much larger scale than we ever saw. There is a very wonderful Tamil film called Merku Todachchimalai, which is Western Ghats, in which they show the whole process by which a man and his wife and family who are basically work, people who go up the hill and come back, a courier. He works as a courier who takes stuff from people, down below to the people who live in the hills, gives it to them and brings back whatever they give and so on. And there are these other workers who are carrying the loads on their backs up and down the hill. And the film follows the story of this one man who, at the end of the process, ends up as a security guard in a wind power farm, right? A wind power farm. That is, you see the last shot of the film shows him, sitting on a chair. Then the camera pulls back to show that he's surrounded by these vast acres of windmills. I mean, these power generating those tall white things. So this proletarianization, the transformation of people, people's lives through this coming of capitalist expansion is on a much larger scale than it ever was. And also mentalities were different then. Now, mentalities are also under pressure. And the new cinemas, you can say, are contributing to as well as reflecting these transformation of subjectivities, right? That's what they are dealing with, the transformation in both in the objective conditions as well as subjective dispositions. And what is this, problem of subjective disposition that is most important is, to my mind, is that to go back to Marxist theory for a bit. Marx talked about the one of the crucial factors in the development of capitalism is the availability of labor power as a commodity, not as something you can commandeer by force, which is what feudal society used to do. That is, in feudal societies, people were obligated to work for the feudal lord, free or on payment, but it was not based on a market. The whole idea of labor power as a commodity is, for the first time, makes of the worker somebody who is in possession of something, right? And what is this possession? It's the body, essentially. The body is possession. Now, this kind of transformation, I believe, is being experienced by people in our midst today. The idea that there is something in you that you can, sell to the market. Now, the experience of becoming aware of one's own bodily capacities, that is to say labor power as a commodity, is something that from inside disturbs, destabilizes, shatters the old edifices of a social order based on hierarchies, right? Honor, respect, fear of social opprobrium, shame, and all of these kinds of things, which together constitute the apparatus of social control under feudal social relations, right? So this new subject with this new possession called labor power, the very consciousness of that somehow becomes, makes the whole thing difficult. Now, I will come back to Masan if we have time, but let me mention here the film Masan, in which this is precisely the conflict between this whole value system of Brahminical Hinduism, in which the irony of it is that there is a police officer who is using those very Brahminical values of honor and shame and chastity and so on, in order to blackmail the father of this girl who has been caught in a hotel room with her boyfriend, right? So in other words, tradition has become a sort of instrument of blackmail, and so the film actually sort of begins by setting up this conflict in which this individual body is trapped in a network of relations of an older kind, and she then wants to emerge from it. She wants to pull her body out of that whole system and into the space of freedom, of uncertainty, risk, and everything. It has all those, but it is her own world, her own choice. So relocation or transmigration, if you like, from one social system to another. So this kind of and if I may say, even in a more commercially oriented film like the film Queen, it's the same thing, except that there it is a question of a very middle class household, and whereas in Masan, it's the economic status is very different for many of the characters, right? So this whole tussle over the body. Now, this is not something that's only happening in cinema. This is happening across the field, and I can only give one example here for lack of time, which is just think of that Hadia case, right? The case where this woman who was who married and converted, and was then subjected by not just her family, not just the people around her family, but also in the Indian law courts, joined, ganged up in a way to sort of try and wrest that body back into its original location. So this is a conflict over bodies that's happening. So in other words, there is, it seems, what's happening is a kind of earlier feminine subjectivity was conscious, it was reconciled to the fact that the body was the family's possession. Right? The body is the family's possession. This was, if there are a lot of moral states. Is it? Am I over time? Deepta, are you saying something?
Yeah, I was just looking at the time. So maybe if you can, but I don't want to stop you in the middle of the flow of your thought. So if you can
Kind of.
wind up after this, making this particular.
Yeah, sure. So the idea is that the older feminine subjectivity, in some ways was achieved stability by by reconciling with the fact that the body belongs to the family, our own body. Now, here in this scenario that we are looking at, this is the struggle to wrest the body back from these many claimants who are, after it. And you see this kind of struggle in two areas in this moment. One is in the case of gender, like female bodies, and the other is caste, the caste body. I was going to mention another film, Fundry, where also you can see how the body is pulled back into that task of pig rearing. So the community and as well as the family together, try to push back. So the claim, the claim of the body that the family always made and was never contested, and often the community made and was never contested, is being contested. And I believe that is one of the most central conflicts around which the new cinemas are being built. I'll stop here. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation, which we will discuss at the end of the panel. I now invite Professor Sanjiv Kumar to make his presentation. He's essentially a political scientist, teaches at Delhi University, and he is increasingly writing on cinema and writing and publishing on cinema, particularly questions of the other in multiple contexts. So on that note, may I request Professor Sanjiv Kumar to make his presentation, 20 minutes for your presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair, and my co-panelists. And thanks, Dhananjay, for having me here. So what I'll do briefly today is to critique whether or it has a kind of decolonial anguish. So to do that, let me differentiate what do I actually mean by post-coloniality and decoloniality. And of course, I'll not get into the technicalities, rather I'll empirically try and locate cinema in terms of what I am trying to argue here. So, of course, we all know post-colonial discourse or the colonial discourse theory is quite rich, but I'll just draw upon Homi Bhabha's notion of ambivalence to describe what I'm trying to say. Indian cinemas, say sort of desire or romance with post-coloniality. And in terms of the post-coloniality or the notion of post-coloniality, I have a very specific Saidian notion of Eurocentrism in mind here. It's not just about the British culture or the British way of life, but it's the larger West-centric discourse that I'm trying to look at, the way in which Indian cinema is trying to, the trials and tribulations where Indian cinema tries to oscillate or tread a very tightrope walk between its West-centrism versus West-centric outreach versus what we call as its intrinsic desire to show or look inward in terms of the Indian heartland. So this is how we can explain this whole idea. We can explain in terms of what Bhabha calls it as ambivalence, in the sense that, like neither colonial discourse nor its reception in a very Derridian sense is always as what Edward Said argued, is not monolithic for Homi Bhabha. So like say Eurocentrism, its discourse and its reception is largely not monolithic. And of course, it's characterized by what Bhabha called as ambivalence, of course, bringing in the whole Derridian question of difference in this respect. So Bhabha is looking at the way in which the idea of the colonizer fascinates the colonized in terms of both desire, and there is also a simultaneous sense of aversion, derision, in terms of like not being like the colonizer. So this whole idea of becoming like a colonizer and also not being like a colonizer, liking as well as disliking, has been represented succinctly in Hindi cinema after independence. 1947. So to briefly discuss those 3 or 4 decades, and then coming to the 90s, and then I will come to the recent era, which Madhav actually discussed elaborately, but I'll try to go in a more historical way, in the sense of looking at the first 4 decades, 3 to 4 decades of Hindi cinema as more in terms of representation.
I think there is some internet issue at.
He's
Dr.
back.
Yeah, he's back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Now you are.
Yeah. Thanks. Sorry. Look. So, yeah, going back to this Nehruvian and post-Nehruvian public culture, in that sense, when we discuss cinema of the 1950s and 60s, where on the one hand, India was grappling with or coming to terms with what we call as the post-colonial condition. This whole idea was what Akhil Gupta describes as post-colonial condition or the post-colonial predicament, equality, where a significant part of the Indian society, so movies like, say, Boot Polish, tended to represent the ills of Indian society. Now, simultaneously, once we see a transition when India was trying to assert itself in terms of global politics, especially, and as a scholar of international relations, I try to put this in a more post-Vietnam syndrome, what we can call, and also India's assertion in terms of its nearness to socialism, which was very apparent with the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation. And despite that, in India, on the one hand, we see the simultaneous representation of poverty, unemployment, like even if it's like a more lighter movie like Kam Chor. But compared to that, the very idea of ambivalence, at least for me in Indian cinema, which I try to portray, is its fascination with Elvis Presley, much of the movie. its fascination with Times magazine, its fascination with Chevrolet cars. Now, consistently in the 1970s, there was a sense of, Eurocentric optimism that was represented in Hindi cinema, post-colonial cinema, but we can call it, if we want to call it post-colonial cinema, where a good upper middle class lifestyle was to be represented through such symbolic representations or significations. There was a semantic and semiotic sense of representing the upper middle class tendencies in terms of what popularly was regarded as symbols of richness. Now, why for me, this is kind of a desire in a very sense of Homi Bhabha. The fact of the matter is, even if we want to look at the way in which in the 1960s Indian economy was considered to be growing at a Hindu rate of growth, and we were going at a high stage of what we call as emergency, and there was economic unrest in the 1970s and all the political stories. But suddenly we also see this whole coming of green revolution. So of course, India itself was traversing through a very mixed path. And of course, Hindi cinema, through its iconic stars like
You have to unmute, sir. You have muted.
sorry. Yeah. So these dark characters, even if Feroz Khan was trying to represent the dark characters, there was a fascination in terms of representing a very European or even a Western lifestyle larger sense, the kind of suits he wears, the kind of goggles that he wears, and the fascination, as I said, for Chevrolet Impala cars. Now, what actually this represents? India after 1947 had to get an agenda for development and an agenda for creating what we call as public culture. Now, there was a readily available option in terms of what the West had offered us, and in terms of popular culture, taking the classic argument of Stuart Hall, where the bourgeois actually tends to reinvent and reproduce its own way of life, the upper middle class way of life, and show it as popular. Now, of course, we cannot say that it's like what today we see, the way in which, say, somebody like Vijay Mallya's lifestyle, how well it is taken by the younger generation. Is it fascinating? So that's a different debate. But the fascination with the upper middle class lifestyle, in the sense of these characters, were actually taking Indian cinema into two distinct paths. On the one hand, there was unemployment which had to be represented, but it has to be romanticized because of the necessity of cinematic realism. The necessity of cinematic realism is very, very simple. You have to sell the movie. So obviously, the beautiful stories of an unemployed youth falling in love with an elite upper middle class girl, that of course the girl ultimately accepting to stay in the lifestyle of the lower middle class guy. Now, this is where there was a sense of restitutive sense of justice that the lower middle class was supposed to get. Now, of course, this simultaneity where desire in terms of Somebody like Firoz Khanna demonstrated in terms of his semantics and semiotics. And simultaneously, somebody like Rajesh Khanna playing a lower middle class role, or Rajendra Kumar playing a lower middle class role, and somebody like Asha Parekh representing. So these were some of the normal characters that we see in that. So this simultaneity of representations became part and parcel of India's post-colonial cinema. And suddenly things were to change in the 1990s when India liberalized, when India wanted foreign direct investment smoothly without the license Raj. Obviously, Indian cinemas began to look outwards, something like DDLJ or Namaste London. Now, the fascination with the NRIs is part of what we call as, again, this whole Homi Bhabha's desire, the ambivalent relationship with the Eurocentric West and India was trying to confront. Of course, in Amrish Puri, there was a sense of going back to the values, but there was a sense where commercially India had to be shown being enterprising and looking outwards. So obviously, this again in the 1990s, although in the changed globalized circumstance, India was looking for foreign direct investments. Obviously, the response that Indian cinema was showing, of course, I'm talking in a very limited empirical sphere, because this is not just limited to it, because since I have a limited argument, I'm just focusing on this kind of cinema, something like Pardes or Namaste London. So DDLJ, these are some of the three movies where you are showing a successful businessman trying to go back, both in Pardesh as well as DDLJ, both the character of Amrish Puri trying to reconnect to his roots. So yeah, since I'm losing time, I think I have just 5 or 6 minutes. The third part of the story is, in a way, what Madhav was talking about, the new cinema, where the ambivalence has taken a significant turn or transition. And for me, this very idea of what Gilles Deleuze calls as the political cinema, there is a sense where the public culture is expected, the cinema is expected that it represents the public culture as well as caters to the needs of the entertainment industry. Now, this dual role, obviously, as I said, even though with an ambivalence, cinema has been consistently undertaking since the 1950s. And in the 1990s, with its fascination with foreign direct investment. Now, today, what sort of India Bollywood cinema is representing? Let us contrast 3 movies. One is Sui Dhaga. Second, Padman. Third, Gheraiyan. And fourth, also we can bring in which also represent a very interesting new direction or transition in Indian cinema, that is Hit, the first case. Now, looking at these 3 or 4 examples, and then I will end my talk. This whole idea of Sui Dhaga, where Atmanirbhar Bharat, the way in which the government of India is trying to represent self-employment. Somewhere down the line, cinema had to represent it because it is part of the public culture and public discourse. Similarly, of the feminine represented in terms of renegotiating the public space. There is a sense of renegotiation of the public space which Anushka Sharma was trying to do when she actually inspired her husband. That was a feminine renegotiation of the public space in a very new India, which is being represented. Similarly, Ad Man. This whole idea of looking at Make in India or connecting it to the power of the feminine. Here, cinema is trying to achieve three broad objectives. Number one, not only to bring in the ills of the Indian society, which consistently cinema was doing, but of course, it may not go down very well with every time with the audience, because major criticism which Satyajit Ray was facing, although he was into art cinema, was that although he's reflecting India in a very negative light. So when you go to a cinema theater, you want to go in a very Jamesonian world. And that is where cinema tries to take a very paranormal kind of a position in terms of treading a utopian as well as an empirical world. And that cinema tried to do it in the movies like Gehraiyan, where it completely catered to a different audience. So normally, which we call as part of quote unquote high culture.
Sanjiv Kumar, would it be possible to wind up in a minute or so?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so if you look at the movie Gehraiyan, the whole idea is half of the movie has English dialogues. Now, why I am emphasizing on this whole idea of English is this post-colonial fascination in terms of representing one class. Because cinema has always been connected to page 3. And page 3 is not just about celebrities and stars. Page 3 is also about businessmen. And that is part of what the new cinema is confronting the challenge also. So when we look at all these 4 movies, especially after 2010, and compare, as I said, one last movie, which is the more recent one, the most astonishing part of that movie is a very candid representation of queer feminine sexuality. Of course, the movie is highly filled with suspense. The movie is completely, passing through all the tests of entertainment, good songs, everything. But the message that it is rendering is this whole idea of acceptability to queer feminine sexuality. And ultimately, the protagonist of the movie says, the dialogue, Sapna's fascination to Preeti was not wrong, but what she did to achieve that was also wrong. So there is a sense of moral responsibility which cinema is also trying to represent, because still, even though after Article 377, we have to go in terms of what we call a social transition to reach a stage where live-in relationships and especially queer relationship in a very post-Butlerian sense are acceptable. Thank you very much.
3:27 p.m.
Yes, screen is frozen. Yeah. Is it all right now? Yeah.
Yeah.
So with that, one can
Dipta, you're not audible.
she teaches at the University of English and Foreign Language University, Hyderabad, and her book, Deities and Devotees, Cinema, Religion and Politics in India, was published in 2018. And it is if I'm not mistaken, it's related to her PhD thesis, which she did at Columbia University. So, Uma, 20 minutes, and yeah, we can start now. No, Uma, you need to unmute.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Deepta, and thank you, Dr. Dhananjay Rai, for inviting me to be part of this panel. Yeah, I'll try and take less than 20 minutes actually, because I'm going to focus on, I had sent in an abstract which had two parts. I will just focus on the first part of that abstract. As Madhav had mentioned, we have been working together on a project where we are trying to think about the new cinemas that are emerging in different Indian languages. Hindi, of course, the first two presentations already mentioned, but there's also been interesting kind of developments in Malayalam, most notably Marathi, and Tamil as well, apart from Hindi. Now, the case of Telugu, since I work on Telugu cinema, one of the questions that has emerged for me as part of this thinking is that why isn't there as robust, and as prolific set of new kinds of cinema in Telugu as there are in, say, Malayalam or Tamil or Marathi. So part of my thinking has been to try and answer this question. Now, it is not as if there are no films in Telugu that would represent a new kind of aesthetic trend or a new sort of economic model. There are examples, and I hope towards the end of the presentation to come to that part. But I was more interested in thinking about what are the challenges and obstacles that stand in the way of a full-fledged sort of blossoming, of the new cinema, as it were. And as part of that, what I'm going to focus on is a trend wherein top stars in the Telugu film industry, and this has been a trend that was there before as well, but there have been a set of films where top male stars in the Telugu film industry have decided to remake an independent new cinema film from different languages. So, for example, the one film that I am going to focus on in this presentation is, many of you must have heard of this film called Pink, which came out in Hindi in 2016. It starred, Amitabh Bachchan as an old lawyer, and the story revolved around three young women who are, find themselves in the middle of a crisis, and when this lawyer decides to step in to help them. Now, that was remade into Telugu, and Amitabh Bachchan's role was played by one of the top male stars in the Telugu film industry, Pavan Kalyan, who many of you might know is also is the brother of a superstar of yesteryears, Chiranjeevi. And like Chiranjeevi, Pavan Kalyan has also entered politics, and currently he is the leader of a political party named Janasena. So it was interesting that he chose to do this film. Now, before I go into a more sort of details of the original film Pink and its remake in Telugu, I also want to mention that there have been other instances of this kind of So Pawan Kalyan himself has done another remake, this time based on a Malayalam film called Ayappam Koshiyum, that which was remade in Telugu as Bhimla Nayak, and another you could say another top star, Venkatesh, no longer at the top as it were, but has the backing of a studio and a vast distribution network. So in that sense, still holds a commanding position in the film industry. He chose to remake a film called Asuran from Tamil, which was originally made by the director Vetrimaran with Dhanush. Now, one of the criticisms of the remake, Narappa, which was the name of the Telugu remake of the film Asuran, was that while Asuran is all about caste oppression, that somehow while the remake sort of faithfully tells the story, almost frame by frame is faithfully remade, the mention of caste is somehow elided. So that was one of the criticisms. Now, in Pink, the remake of Pink as well, can I share screen so that I can quickly show a couple of images? Okay, 1 minute. So in the remake of Pink as well, oh, it says I'm disabled from screen sharing. Yeah, while you perhaps enable me to do that, I will.
I think
We have enabled that. You can do it
Yeah.
now.
Can you see this now? Yeah. Can you see my screen?
No, not yet.
Oh, let me.
There would be a green colored share screen option.
Right. Yeah, no. I know that option. I'm now trying to. I seem to have lost my. Let me not waste time trying to. Okay, maybe I will just. Okay, yeah. Can you see my thing now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay. So this was many of you would have seen this. This was made, Pink was made in 2016. And it featured Amitabh Bachchan as an old, tired lawyer who is out of practice lawyer because he has some mental health issues. He's battling both his own mental health issues as well as his wife is dying. So it is in this kind of situation that he decides to step in to help these three young working women, who find themselves in trouble. So now now Pink was, as Madhav mentioned in his presentation, is part of the new set of cinemas which is sort of reconfiguring gendered politics. So this film was a suspense drama in which the story shows us these young women fleeing from a resort, followed by some young men, one young man who's bleeding from his head. And so the whole then the film proceeds first as a kind of an investigative and then moves into a court drama kind of situation, where we are not told about, or we are not shown exactly what happened. It is only in the course of the the court drama that we gather that the young men had tried to molest them, and that in self-defense these women had sort of attacked one of them. But the whole film, the tone of the film, the mood is very grim. It's suspenseful. it teeters on that, it plays on the audience expectations and also unambiguity about what these young women had actually done. So, and it also plays on this thing about working women, that as young working women living by themselves in Delhi, you know, the city is very much quite a character in the film. They're always under suspicion for, you know, their morality is questioned, you know, what kind of work they do, because there's always this suggestion that they may be actually, you know, prostitutes, or that. So now in this film, Amitabh Bachchan's role is quite central, and one could always find fault with the film for, you know, the for that, you know, there's a long women's movement which in India, which brought some of these issues to the fore. But in a film like this, a senior actor like Amitabh Bachchan becomes the mouthpiece for a kind of feminist, becomes the feminist voice, and he is the one who sort of reinstates this slogan that no means no, and speaks for these young women. Now, if we sort of critique the Hindi film itself for the way in which it uses a senior male star, you know, but we should also note that in Pink, despite the sort of star status, as it were, of Amitabh Bachchan, there is I want to now show you. You know, the contrast. Amitabh Bachchan is, as I said, an old and aging man. Most of the time, he is seen in, you know, he is seen many times when he is moving around in the city. He is wearing this mask, which presumably because he's old and because of the Delhi pollution. So you know, he is not this figure of sort of a masculine power. Whereas once we get to Pawan Kalyan in you know, as reprising this role, you can see the difference. You know, this was the poster that was issued and on Women's Day. And here is he sitting with a book which says Women, Law and Criminal Justice, but also with something that looks like a baseball bat, and the way in which he is sitting. So the main difference between the Telugu remake, as you can see, it is called Vakil Saab, you know, which also, and in the title itself, we can see the silhouette of the male star. And in the Telugu remake, there is a centering of this male character. He is given a backstory, whereas in the Hindi Pink, you hardly get to see. There are only brief sort of suggestions of what Amitabh Bachchan's career as a lawyer, or we don't get to see much of that. We don't also get to see much about the past lives of these young women. Whereas in the Telugu remake, not only are these young women firmly established, their families, we get a good sense of their backgrounds, where they come from, and they are also, by the end of the film, sort of more or less happily restored to those families, except the one young, this woman in the middle is Zarina, a Muslim woman. She ends up breaking with her boyfriend by the end of the film. But the other two are sort of restored to their families. One is happily married off, whereas there is no such suggestion in the Hindi film. And the other main point that I want to make is that Pawan Kalyan, the film also becomes a vehicle. So he is shown as a student. So there is this flashback with him where he is shown as a student leader in Osmania University. So there references to the Telangana agitation and the centrality of the students in that. So there are as many as 4 or 5 major fight sequences involving the young, where he comes in to rescue these young women. So all in all, the point that I'm trying to make is that the kind of gendered politics, the new kind of gender reconfiguration of the gender politics that that Pink attempts is sort of undermined by reinstating a male hero, in the Telugu remake. There are again, the way the music is used, the melodramatic tone. So the more suspenseful drama that Pink is transformed into a very heavy dialogue-oriented melodrama in Telugu. But so what are the reasons for this? What are, if one were to think, and I will end with that. So what are the reasons why an industry like the Telugu cinema is unable to welcome, some of the more newer kinds of aesthetic or thematic concerns that some other industries? For one, while other film scholars have argued this, that the Telugu industry is a very rich industry compared to, say, the Malayalam industry, or even the Marathi film industry. So today, many of you would know Telugu cinema for its big pan-India blockbusters like, Bahubali or RRR, right? So that is where, so it is an industry that which is sort of heavily, capital kind of intensive one. So there is a lot of, and one is that, and the second is, it's what Madhav in his earlier work had called the, cine politics. That is the Telugu film industry's continuing link, which is after the formation of Telangana, it is not as strong, but the continuing sort of link between the cinema screen and politics. So Pawan Kalyan is a representative of that older cine politics, and there's an investment on holding on to those. So these seem to be kind of obstacles too. So there is both a kind of the male stars are looking for newer stories, but are not able to fully embrace the kind of newer sort of reconfiguring of, what Madhav had earlier called the new subjectivities that are emerging as part of our neoliberal present, the Telugu industry, and which is male star dominated, and is not able to. And I will end with this, that but there are still now other kinds of much smaller, low budget kind of attempts, people who are coming in through, after having made themselves a name through the YouTube, or those who have made smaller, medium budget films with actors who are not stars. So there are those kinds of trends which are emerging, but which have not yet somehow, which there are attempts. So some of the more big budget films will try to sort of co-opt some of these newer elements, but it is still quite a bit of a struggle. And I think the success of these pan-Indian blockbusters like an RRR or a Bahubali, in fact, might act as more as a setback to some of the newer efforts. But that's where we are in the Telugu film industry. I will stop with that. Thank you.
So thank you, Umar, dead on time. And I now ask Dr. Syed Haider. He's from the University of East Anglia, and he is from the School of, he lectures on world cinema at the University of East Anglia, and he's currently working on a monograph on Muslim modernities and the Hindi screen. He is, I think, that is also his subject as a part of his PhD. So he's interested in looking at the relationship between, looking at the construction of British Muslim modernity, if I may say so, and he's in particular looking at the construction of those modernities in relation to Hindi cinematic narrative. So on that note, may I request you to make your presentation 20 minutes? Yeah.
Certainly, I've got the clock on the go. Thank you, Dipta, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to jump straight in, if that's all right. In her book, Popular Hindi Cinema, Aesthetic Formations of the Seen and Unseen, Ronnie Parsiak attempts to realize three distinct objectives. One, to push against a tendency within the scholarship of Hindi cinema that prioritizes socio-political analysis of Hindi films at the expense of their religious and aesthetic qualities. Two, to trace the foundational importance of Hindu traditions for Hindi cinema, the aesthetic, the narrative, and the philosophic. And three, a serious consideration of whether cinematic apparatus can provide its spectators with a real notion of the unseen, a real, that is, philosophically valid understanding of what subsists beyond samsara. A tool endowing its audience at least a momentary sense of liberation, or moksha, as she refers to it. This third objective is both her most ambitious objective, but also one that causes her project to overreach itself. Reading her work was most engaging because I found myself agreeing with her in one sentence and then immediately disagreeing with her in the next. For example, Parsiak's commitment to balancing the need for cultural sensitivity while avoiding essentialist readings of Hindi cinema is commendable, as I agree with her, and will seek to demonstrate here, that a reading of Hindi cinema which avoids exoticizing it offers a unique insight into what we may term broadly aesthetic experience. Where I find myself disagreeing with her is in what she does next. To illustrate her point that her philosophical interpretation of Hindi cinema may be applicable to Western cinema as well, she offers a provocative interpretation of this climatic scene in Ken Russell's 1975 classic, Tommy. There she refers to the final scene of the film, which she says presents the new image of its protagonist, a healthy, blooming youth, climbing the highest mountain. The soundtrack is rhythmic, stimulating a sense of arousal and ecstasy. Facing the glorious sunrise, the protagonist spreads out his arms in a way mimicking the iconography of the crucified Christ. Can the protagonist, she asks, be considered a mere illustration of Christ, or is he an actual physical incorporation of the Christian Lord? Is Christ himself present in the reality shaped by the film? Parsiak recognizes that such an interpretation is precluded by the dominant view in Judeo-Christian tradition, which sees God as transcendental and not manifesting in matter, and in Christological terms, Christ as a historical figure who appeared once in a specific point in time, and should he return, we can be sure Christians would argue it would not be in celluloid form. That being so, Parsiak notes that interpretive efforts through this lens can at best only say Tommy may serve as an illustration of the figure of Christ, or hint at a realization of soteriological features anchored in some Christian perspectives in the tribulations of the flesh. For her, adhering to orthodox Western transcendental interpretations can therefore miss key significances created and manifested through film. A closer look at motion pictures through Hindu spectacles, she says, might therefore help us understand the wondrously religious functions of cinema as a medium, whether Western or Indian. It is here that I think she goes wrong for two important reasons. For one thing, she overstates the centrality of Hindu traditions and culture for Hindi cinema. In fact, what is most exciting about Bollywood and what is currently under much threat is its eclecticism and unique blend of religion and secularity. And to illustrate this, I would play, but I won't do it now, but play two clips that I have in mind. I'm sure you're familiar with Imtiaz Ali's 2011 film Rockstar and Anand Del Rey's 2013 film Ranjana. And the scenes I have in mind are the scene in Rockstar where the protagonist visits the Nawazuddin sort of dargah in Delhi. And in Ranjana, Anand Del Rey's film, the song Tum Tak, where we see sort of Dhanush's character, Kundan, sort of playing in, celebrating Holi when Zoya, Sonam Kapoor's character, sort of comes in, sort of smears him with some color and then coquettishly walks away from him, and he follows, and through a mist of color he enters on a Muslim mohalla, or a Muslim neighborhood, where in fact they're celebrating Eid, and he dances with the children there, and then falls back in a whole set of colors basically that spring up in slow motion on the screen. So I want to ask, how different are these scenes, the Dargah scenes in Kun Fayakun, the song in Rockstar, and the scene in Tumtak from Ranjana? How different are these to the closing scenes in Tommy? Does their power, engagement of and our understanding or enjoyment of them depend on hidden or deeply embedded structures of one mythos or another? Or instead, does their affective quality issue from something less metaphysical, as Parsiak is doing in her work, and something more corporeal, namely the body? The cinematic experience, exemplified by Bollywood's aesthetic of excess, but not exclusive to it, is an embodied experience. This is at the heart of the concept of aesthetic identities that I am exploring in my work. The reason I have started this talk with a brief discussion of Parsiak's work is because I endorse her challenge to raise the stakes for scholarship on Bollywood. Parsiak's radical, even outlandish interpretation of Tommy in a volume on Hindi cinema levels the divide between discussions of different cinemas, because she is balancing the need to assess each cinema in its own socio-historical terms, but also probing the possibility of discussing the cinematic experience of each as grounded in the universality of cinematic apparatus itself. What is more, while I disagree with her attempts to read Hindu philosophy in and through Bollywood films, the fact that in her interpretation of Tommy, she applies ideas from within Hinduism, I see this as a bold epistemic move. While it is fairly common to subject non-Western objects of study to concepts and ideas developed within a Western academic context, it is less common to do the opposite. That is, apply concepts from beyond the Western academe to Western products, such as Hollywood films. I read this moment in her book as a brief illustration of what a decolonized episteme may look like. In my work more broadly, and this talk and the paper that I'm working on, I'm extending the possibility of seeing what we can learn from Hindi films that is broader than merely what Hindi films can tell us about India. As such, I find myself agreeing with Parsiak's first objective, namely the need to raise the importance of an aesthetic appraisal of Hindi cinema, so as to balance current scholarship's disproportionate focus on reading these films from a socio-political perspective. Her second objective, I would modify by challenging its overly Hindu-centric focus. And the third I would reject, and this is what I want to turn my attention to next. The way I am defining aesthetic identities follows a similar move to how Brigitte Mayer is defining aesthetics, which is to say, not in Kantian terms, the idea of disinterested beauty, but in the more encompassing Aristotelian notion of aesthesis, which designates the psychosomatic perception of the world through the senses. Mayer's starting point it is a challenge to Benedict Anderson's idea of nations as imagined communities. Compelling and groundbreaking as Anderson's contribution has been, Mayer seeks to amend Anderson's emphasis on the power of the imagination. She argues that Anderson does not sufficiently explain how products of the imagination, such as nations, could engender in their imaginers such strong affective bonds. For Mayer, imaginations need to become tangible outside the realm of the mind by creating a social environment that materializes through the structure of space, architecture, ritual performance, and by inducing bodily sensations. Put differently, in order to be experienced as real, imagined communities need to materialize in the concrete, lived environment and be felt in the bones, so to speak. While Meyer is interested in substituting Anderson's notion of communities as imagined entities with the idea that imagined communities are affective precisely because they do not operate nor emerge in only the imagination of its members, but bind its members through the senses and thus by extension through the body, I want to pursue a narrower idea using cinema and Bollywood specifically as my case study. This narrower idea is of aesthetic identities. I am not claiming that in watching Bollywood films, people form a community, though undoubtedly a community of viewers exists across the world. Nor am I claiming that by watching Hindi films, one displaces their many identities in favor of an aesthetic, in the favor, I should say, of an aesthetic identity. However, the experience of Bollywood specifically and cinematic experience more broadly, I claim, hold the viewer differently, position them uniquely, such that they experience not transcendence or moksha, as Parsiak thinks, but a sense of alterity, a place, a space, a mode of experience that allows us to enjoy a moment of suspension, to be in our bodies, but outside of the markers of identity that otherwise style our bodies and furnish our imaginations. To be embodied beings in that moment and not confessional beings. And I think something that sort of, I hope substantiates my sort of hypothesis or claim is I think the attack that we've seen, particularly in the current sort of political climate within India, the attacks on Bollywood, the sort of feeling that Bollywood itself is some sort of fifth column, against the Hindutva project, I think speaks to this. There's a nervousness within particular fundamentalist, authoritarian political imaginaries against the fluidity, perhaps, and the open-endedness or nature of cinema and the cinematic experience more broadly in some ways. If transcendence has any utility here, it is closer to what Vivian Sobchak has said about human beings who, as lived bodies, have the capacity for transcendence, for a unique exteriority of being, an ecstasis that locates us elsewhere and otherwise, even as we are grounded in and tethered to our lived bodies here and now. But what is being transcended? In Parsiak's terms, it would be a move from the seen to the unseen, to knowledge of Brahma, or the disembarkation from the shores of empirical reality, as she puts it. In Sobchak's case, it is a transcendence grounded in immanence, though that doesn't quite explain what one is supposedly transcending. If Parsiak's approach is too esoteric, then Sobchak's view is compelling but incomplete. This is where I think Bollywood has something to offer us in terms of understanding aesthetic experience and illustrating what I mean by aesthetic identities. Since its inception, the Indian nation state has struggled with the Muslim question. Numerous publications explore this conundrum, both old and new. And all such publications speak to the persistent challenge in India of incorporating the Muslim body into the body politic. This national preoccupation bleeds into Hindi cinema. Much of the academic discourse on Muslim representation within Bollywood traces the unease and tension within the narratives of political dramas and thrillers that directly address the question of Muslim citizenship and Muslim patriotism. This unease can be expressed through dialogue that is clumsy and bungling, either because it is self-consciously didactic, or because it is accompanied by non-diegetic elements that gracelessly and sometimes shamelessly sentimentalize the screen. Other depictions can move in the opposite direction and cross the line into jingoism. Yet others are unable to manage the material intellectually, and because the cinematic text is always polysemic, certain choices by well-meaning filmmakers renders the narrative open to counter readings that in fact highlight the problem of Muslim representation when approached through a political lens, as opposed to the overt attempt by such filmmakers to rehabilitate a Muslim Indian identity. And I'm thinking of, I think it's a 2008 film, for example, Amir, and you can think of others. Yet, and it is a big yet, this same cinema and this same national imagination, which struggles with Muslims as citizens, inaugurates an aesthetics closely allied with Muslims, Islam, and via Marshall Hodgson, an Indian Islamicate. How and why is this possible? There are different answers to this question, ranging from those inspired by psychoanalysis and post-colonial discourse, or springing from a quasi-post-structuralist analysis. For instance, one could posit that the other is always constitutive of the self, and that in fascist, racist, and xenophobic cultures, the other retains a sort of allure, a strange libidinal attraction to the very thing being excised. Alternatively, one could argue that there is a link between the flourishing of an idealized and sanitized Muslim presence on the Hindi screen with the increasing hostility faced by India's Muslim population. As if to say, the fecundity of Muslim representation in Hindi cinema either hides the marginalization of Indian Muslims or buttresses the simulacrum. If only the Muslims out there could be like the Muslims on the big screen. Compelling though these answers are, they do not capture the whole range of possibilities. They do not fully explain why a hostile imaginary does not simply eschew the whole Islamicate, as indeed some of the most extreme Hindutva acolytes do. Nor does it offer much remedy to the precarity of Muslim life in India. Another answer lies in the triadic relationship between Parsiak's faith in the cinematic apparatus, Brigitte Mayer's notion of the nation as an aesthetic formation, and my own work on aesthetic identity. To illustrate this briefly, and it will be brief, consider once again Imtiaz Ali's 2011 box office hit, Rockstar. The film opens in Italy at the Verona Arena, where preparation for a huge concert are underway. Successive shots of growing crowds, musicians setting up, and technicians testing sound levels establishes the contemporary nature of the music that is due to be performed on the erected stage, surrounded by large posters and life-size cutouts of Jordan, or Janardhan Jangar, also called JJ, played by Ranbir Kapoor. When an angry and temperamental Jordan arrives on stage after a brawl on the streets of Verona, a sudden cut transfers the audience in time and space back to India and to a younger, more innocent-looking Janardhan singing at an audition in college. However, as this song takes off, the editing becomes even more wandering, taking us to different performances throughout JJ's life so that the audience sees the physical transformations he has gone through. What remains the same is the song he sings in each avatar. The lyrics, penned by Irshad Kamil, are revealing insofar as they express the notion that each one of us, you and I and all of us, are mirrors for one another. So why not look for ourselves in those others that are around us? Perhaps I exist and yet perhaps I do not. What is true and what is wrong? Perhaps I am you, and in finding me, you may end up finding yourself. The lyrics resonate with the scenes over which they play, as the scenes show JJ singing to people of all colors and hues, from all walks of life and from across the world. Music, which is so central to the plot of the film, is also here presented as somehow bridging gaps and drawing people together. The collage of scenes, the lyrics, and the melody of the track, together with the colors and lighting and changing mise-en-scène, help achieve the immersion that cinema is so uniquely capable of. This is captured perfectly in the middle of the film, when Janardhan is kicked out of his home by his brutish brothers and, having no place to go, ends up at the famous shrine, the Dargah in Delhi. Here, the sounds of Qawwali and the devotion expressed reignites Janardhan's passion for music, while the setting of the shrine allows Ali to captivate, that's the director, to captivate his audience by filming the visual and oral splendor of the Dargah and its many ceremonies. To this end, the Rubai of the Qawwali, Kun Fayakun, acts as a sound bridge that takes us into a flashback to reveal where JJ has been for the 2 months that are unaccounted for since he was thrown out of his house. A fade-in shot, and I'm going to wrap up shortly, A fade-in shot accentuates the mystical devotional atmosphere that the opening of the Qawwali creates, and a slow descent of the camera adds to this further, as it captures in near silhouette the real-life Qawwals from the dargah assembled before the shrine late at night. Then, as other vocals and instruments begin to build, increasing the tempo too, the audience is treated to the market outside the dargah, where devotees and visitors can purchase flowers and other devotional objects. The golden lights that adorn the main dome of the shrine, in addition to the lattice work of panels that are part of the design, are also captured beautifully, so that all in all, the audience is given an aesthetic experience of this famous mausoleum. Final paragraph. This sequence in the film, and many others in a number of other films, is part of what I have termed the aestheticization of Islam and Muslims in Hindi cinema, that is increasingly presenting the aesthetics as a counterpoint to the political, although I wouldn't push this juxtaposition too far. Indeed, by appealing to the senses, certain aesthetic arrangements of sound, color, and texture may simulate the somatic experience, which, by virtue of the fact that even though identities are discursively constructed, they are nonetheless an embodied and performative phenomenon. Thus, songs as sensation-bound, embodied aesthetic experiences may engender aesthetic identities. So in terms of the churning that Dhananjay was talking about at the beginning, I think there is something, what I'm exploring is the somatic as distinct from the semiotic, and whether that distinction offers us new ways of thinking about, talking about the cinema that is emerging, the new cinema in many ways, and what we can learn from the cinema, as opposed to just what the cinema tells us about India. Thank you.
You have to unmute.
Yeah, we've been very responsible in terms of time, I must say. And yeah, so now we will invite questions and comments. Nutan, how should we do this? Should we ask for questions in the chat box, or should people just unmute themselves and ask?
Yes, ma'am. One can unmute and ask question directly here.
So I invite questions, and I can see Dhananjay has his hand up. So Dhananjay, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. And I have a question to each panelist, to start with Professor Madhav Prasad. And I really like this formulation of the capitalist subjectivity, and we have a Hindi cinema, or new cinema actually, in the context of India. But do we also see the resurrection of the modern subjectivity, where you keep caste but present yourself as egalitarian? So do we have resurrection of the capitalist subjectivity along with the kind of subjectivity capitalist society to demand? This is from Madhav Prasad. This is the next is from Professor Sanjiv Kumar. What constitutes this ambivalence in cinema? We know in the context of nation state of post-coloniality, but what is the constitution of ambivalence in the context of cinema? Has this ambivalence been extended to marginal groups in terms of Dalits or minorities, or it remains post-colonial only? I mean, this ambivalence is presented only in the context of West or East. Has it been extended to the marginal section in Indian cinema? And to Uma, this is really interesting. But one is this, that we see often we see the assertion of the right in Hindi cinema to actors and directors. But what explains the reduction of the left in footnote in Asuran? I mean, the Asuran is a very powerful film, and I think which is influenced by the real left struggle. But the entire political left has been reduced to the footnote in that film. What does it explain? And to say, I think this is interesting. I mean, but this is my query. why do you prefer Aristotelian dramatic over Brechtian epic theater? I think many would like to have Brecht epic theater over Aristotelian, in a sense that, and can we maintain autonomy of aesthetic identity when we had communal consumer, and can we have communal consumer and secular aesthetics together in the context of Hindi cinema? And secondly, do we have this fluidity? I mean, can we say that has fluidity dried up in the context of Hindi cinema vis-a-vis Muslim representation?
I'm wondering if we can take all the questions together and then perhaps each of the panelists could respond. Yeah. So in which case, Eshika, can we have your question?
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes.
So my question is for Professor Sanjiv. So this is similar to Dhananjay sir's question about what ambivalence is. I understand ambivalence in terms of what Sanjiv sir told about how in the post-LPG period, the ambivalence in Hindi cinema was noticed in terms of fascination with NRIs, and also talk about how India was always looking outwards in those movies. But at the same time, the main characters always come back to the great Indian values, emphasizing the traditions of the great Indian family. So how would this concept of ambivalence, this post-colonial concept of ambivalence, would function in the domain of what Madhav sir termed as new cinema, and what Sanjiv sir also emphasized it in relation to Delhi's political cinema. So how would this ambivalence work in new cinema or in the domain of political cinema? So that is the question for Professor Sanjiv. And another one is just an observation on the analysis of the movie Pink made by Uma ma'am. So Uma ma'am kind of in her argument defended the character of Deepak Sehgal played by Amitabh Bachchan when compared to the Pawan Kalyan remake. So while that is very apt, but I believe the problem does not lie in the fact that the character of Deepak Sehgal, the problem does not lie in the powerlessness of Deepak Sehgal, but the problem was with the fact that the person who played the character, Amitabh Bachchan, the directors, the screenwriters, and other producers decided to install a person, Amitabh Bachchan, who is the archetype of the angry young man of the 1980s, or the powerful paternal figure of Bollywood, or who we can understand as the representation of the symbolic order. So the problem lies in that, and not in the fact that Deepak Sehgal as a character was very old and he was aging, always using masks and everything. The problem lies in the fact that it was a very powerful Bollywood celebrity was made the mouthpiece of feminism, thereby implying implicitly that the feminist messages would not be taken seriously had they been voiced by a female person or any other man who do not enjoy as much power as Amitabh Bachchan does. So that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eshika. Perhaps what we can do is each of the panelists could respond to the questions that have been raised.
Take questions together. Professor Mohanty is.
Professor Mohanty would like to ask a question.
Yes. Another fantastic panel. I'm very educated. I have a very simple question. Now our life is very much getting filled by the new Netflix, Sony Live, the global monopoly capitalist entering the sector. And has it increased the autonomous capacity of the struggling forces? or has it, added new dimensions to the various struggles, class, caste, gender struggles in the aesthetic realm? If my proposition would be that it has actually diluted the intensity of class struggle and sought to redirect the aesthetic sensibilities in what would be, from their point, manageable direction. Will that be a correct reading? I think the whole panel may consider this anxiety. Thank you.
May I ask?
Manindra?
Yeah. Two small questions. One to Uma. Uma, you explained that why things were changed when Hindi film was translated into Telugu. I'd like to know from you a little more detail about that. Is it only the political economy that there is a leadership, there is the desire to become political and therefore it was used like that? Or it was more than that? Why I'm asking this question, I have a feeling that films, in order to become a success story, required to nurture or serve a kind of a story which is already available in the collective consciousness. That has to be connected. Like a person like Amitabh Bachchan could not have been accepted by another audience as somebody who would take up this case. So that is something that I would like to know. And Heather, I think, how do you explain? I see two perspectives that you are trying to project. And how do you explain a film like PK in this case? Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Or shall we move to the panelists? Yeah. So in which case, perhaps we could, Madhav could go first, followed by Sanjiv, Kumar, and Syed.
Yeah, I'm afraid I did not catch Dhananjay's question. It was there was a lot of the voice was breaking up. So is that could you repeat that quickly? Or?
Yeah, just one. I mean, along with the capitalist subjectivity, we have also pre-modern subjectivity, where we have you keep a caste intact, but propose a kind of impossible egalitarianism.
Impossible?
Egalitarianism, like Article 15.
Well, yeah, again, I mean, what the state provides in terms of articles and so on, in the terms of the law, is one thing, which reflects, I guess, what was possible in the negotiation, in the sort of demands of various sections, and what they were able to achieve through their exercise of their power, which was not much. There were certain basic provisions, of course. But in terms of cinema, if you look at precisely the film based on this article, you can see that within this new kind of aesthetic frame, there is already an exploitative dimension that has arisen. Article 15. I mean, if you know the terms black exploitation, and which is, if you can think of this as Dalit exploitation cinema, which is actually coming within the terms of this framework, where a kind of central figure protagonist who is very much identifiable for a sort of the new middle class audience, takes you through the motions of awareness of issues and so on. So in that sense, the obviously the caste is not set aside; it's intact, as you're suggesting. But what I was trying to say is, for instance, if you look at Fundry, so on, the ground is getting transformed so that collective struggles are no longer the sort of medium in which people express their emotions and so on. There is an individualization. That's where the neoliberal character of the present comes in. That even in Fundry, for instance, the boy, there is a disidentification with both with the family, as well as the hostility or a suspicion of the oppressive presence of the other communities there. So in that sense, the current transformation is such as to drive everybody, including those who might have only believed in the possibility of collective struggles in the past, to imagine individualized routes to freedom. I don't know if that answers the question, but I hope we can talk about it some other time if it's not. About the OTT question, I think that's the other one that's generally posed. Right, what it is doing, OTT, it's a separate question, so it's too large. So I did not talk about it in that presentation. But actually what it's doing is, it's in some ways absorbing some of the aesthetic charge of the new cinema into its own rentier machinery. It's it's also introducing a kind of script writing kind of frenzy into the mix. So there is a lot of mimesis of imitation of Hollywood style or other types of web series. So in a way, content, Indian sort of characters are being thrust into certain kind of algorithms, if you like, cultural algorithms, which are already tested in various other countries of the world. That's one of the things that they're doing, and they're doing a very shoddy job of it at present. You can see that it's some of these things produced by these writing rooms, as they are called, have at the level of script, they're extremely shoddy work. But I think that's where it's going. So these platforms are trying to offer a service which will encompass and sort of relativize the individual character of each of these products, so that they're distinctive. The cinema, where every film is used to be considered a distinctive artifact, a work of art, or whatever, is now subject to this kind of, it becomes a part of a gallery of films, endless gallery, endless list of them. And so, yeah, I don't know whether to say that it's how it is working, with or against the class struggle, but it's certainly sort of creating new content which is internationalized in terms of formats and so on. And what that does, we can we have to wait and see. Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
All right. Sanjiv,
Yeah. Okay. Am I audible?
yes.
Okay. So let me begin with Professor Mohanty's argument or intervention. So obviously it's in a way it's challenge in terms of commercial realism of cinema also because of the whole commercial quotient that it brings in. But the entire way in which India is still not so internet friendly, in the sense that how many of them actually use OTT platforms and how many of them are still really glued to their televisions and cinema halls. And of course, that needs a very significant statistical analysis to understand. But still, I consider that at least in terms of the rural heartland, Hindi cinema or any cinema, regional cinema, plays a significant role even today. So that's maybe a simplistic argument, but that's where I'll settle with. Dhananjay, yeah, like what constitutes post-coloniality in, ambivalence in Bollywood? Obviously, the ontological situatedness of the Indian society, or let me not call it as a public culture, but the larger social setup that India actually has. Like I'll just give an example, the way in which the movie watching, if you have a survey of the movie watching in the 1980s, 90s, there is a trajectory that you can actually map. Like there used to be morning show and matinee. So if you look at the spectator composition of those shows, it was completely different, maybe retired people or even to some extent college students. And evening first show, that's where the spectator composition completely changed. And when it comes to the night second show, the spectator composition also changed. Of course, that's one way of looking at it. But even if you look at the predicament of Indian cinema, if we want to call it as a post-colonial predicament of Indian cinema, it is an inevitability that Indian cinema has to represent all this. But if you compare, say, Hollywood, if you look at a pattern wherein which, even if I bring in C. Wright Mill's argument of America being a middle class dominated society, what C. Wright Mills calls as the power elite. So the whole idea of cinema had one dominant narrative that actually encompassed much of movie making. Say 50s, 60s obsession with, say, communism, 70s, 80s, the very oriental representation of what we call as the Gulf societies and the Arab and Middle Eastern societies, the underworld, something like True Lies. So there is a there is a one popular narrative that holds larger cinema making, or even like the cyborg society which America was facing, but like Terminator or Robocops. So, but if you compare it with Bollywood cinema, the inevitability of catering to 3 levels of audience, because India is not fully urban, India is not fully rural. And of course, it may not even fit Emmanuel Wallerstein's semi-periphery. Also, the uniqueness of Indian society and the catering, the need to cater to the post-colonial narrative of development lies at the ontological situatedness of the ambivalence. So I may say that it was inevitable, but yeah, what if Bollywood cinema produced era-wise single narrative movies like the Hollywood? Well, the story would have been different. Similarly, what Ishika asked, yeah, returning back to family values in the 90s and what about today? Yeah, obviously, even if new cinema is largely about not retrieving the family values, but it's about the conditions of a post-globalization society. So we all accept the hard realities of the post-globalization or post-neoliberal society where economic inequalities have been deepening. So there has to be some sort of a retrieval in terms of romanticism that Bollywood needs to be showing by romanticizing success stories like Sui Dhaga. So obviously new cinema has a responsibility. That is where Deleuze's whole idea of political cinema is purely entertainment, but whatever cinema shows is not just pure not a political message. Largely, it has to have a social message, and it is the responsibility of the filmmakers. And that is where, again, the ambivalence of something in game.
I think Professor Sanjiv Kumar, your voice is breaking. And I think perhaps screen is frozen. Uma, perhaps we can carry on. And Uma, could you respond to some of the questions?
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. I'll start with what the point that Ishika raised. Ishika, you're right. I mean, I agree with what you have to say about Pink. In fact, that's what I said, that Amitabh Bachchan becomes the spokesperson for the women's movement, as it were, and obviously his star power is used in the film, to attract. You could say that to attract audiences, or you could even say that there's a way in which there's a reinstatement of a male figure, but I think in spite of that, Pink as a film, the narrative manages to open up some possibilities, to raise some questions, the way in which that Amitabh's character is developed, the way the narrative moves. Whereas I think when you contrast it with the Telugu remake, some of the problems become sort of magnified, so the male character is given even more kind of a space in the narrative. It becomes his film. He becomes this human rights lawyer who's now going to speak on behalf of the people, and so on. So while I agree with the argument you're making about Pink, I'm thinking that why is it that even the kinds of boundaries that Pink was able to push, why is it that in Telugu cinema is not able to do? So that was the question, which takes me to this question that Manindra raised about, you're right, that in different audiences, filmmakers negotiate with the audiences that they are addressing. So in that sense, one could say that the Telugu audience, so Pawan Kalyan is a star, and so it's the in fact, if we have a message that we want to give the audience, then who better than him to carry the message of gender equality and so on. But my argument is that somebody who is a star like him, in fact, becomes an obstacle for pushing, bringing in newer narratives. And there's a way in which there is a domestication or a the sort of drawing these new possibilities, new narrative possibilities into older molds because of, so for the economics or the industry, maybe that becomes necessary. So in that sense, the star becomes an obstacle rather than an enabling kind of figure. To Dhananjay's question, I'm not sure if I, so you're saying that in Asuran, the left sort of history is that Dhananjay? Well, I think, in the Tamil Nadu, there's been, first of all, a different kind of, I think, lineage, political lineage, with the influence of the Dravidian DMK kind of ideology. And so more recently, the foregrounding of the caste question, and that kind of those politics there, do not allow, I think, for the sort of, there has not been a left kind of, whereas I would think that in Telugu cinema, there is a history because of for at least a period of time, the sort of ML movement, the Naxalite movement was a very powerful kind of, influence. Even in popular culture in Telugu cinema, there is a, which some people may say is, and that is the reason for the resistance to addressing the caste question. You don't have the kind of Dalit cinema that you have in Tamil or in Marathi, in Telugu, for that reason. So that would be another way of looking at that presence or absence of the left.
Shall we move on to Syed?
Sure. Okay, so first of all, why the Aristotelian and not, say, a Brechtian? Well, to be fair, that was something that I think Brigid Meir is sort of doing a little bit more of. But I'm not particularly wedded to one or another. For me, the point is sort of thinking about the sensation embodied somatic dimension of cinematic experience, the act of viewing a film, being engrossed in it, being pulled in by it, etc. So I think there, the notion of the disinterested aesthetics of Kant is perhaps not so alive or relevant in the argument. It doesn't help. The Aristotelian notion of catharsis and things like that aren't necessarily the key things either that I'm sort of attracted to or drawing upon. And I think Brecht's also sort of aesthetics, if they're, the notion of estrangement or defamiliarizing the familiar, I think those are helpful as well. But what I'm pushing towards is actually familiarizing the unfamiliar. So looking at it from the Muslim question, how does something that has been othered or in other places is defamiliar, if you like, has been sort of made strange, how does this cinema perhaps bring it into familiarity, and into a sort of sense of what the lyrics, for example, from, naively perhaps, in Rockstar are saying, which is that I might be in you and you might be in me, and etc. etc. So sort of, schmaltzy perhaps, but nonetheless, that's the question that I'm grappling with, and I'm trying to create a space, a distinction between the somatic and the semiotic. So kind of almost suggesting that the semiotic can get in the way, the discursive, the discourse-bound identities of Muslim, Hindu, that discursive structuring is something that cinema momentarily has the opportunity to sort of pull us from a little bit, perhaps not entirely, not sort of unequivocally, but create a space, a gap, and in that gap something could happen in the spectorial experience. And I think the cinema of the Indian cinema, what the cinema of excess, as Bollywood sometimes is, actually might be peculiarly and particularly good at creating those kind of gaps into which or from which sort of, so I mean, to pick up Sanjiv's point about, Baba, that liminality, that creating those sort of creating those spaces through the spectorial experience, which is more somatic perhaps than semiotic, is a hypothesis, is something I'm kicking around and trying to shape for this paper as well. I'm not sure I understood what you were saying about the communal and the aesthetic. So you said something, I tried to make a note of it. You said something about the communal consumer and the aesthetic identity. I think you were sort of pushing towards that. I'm not entirely sure I caught that. And then the third one, I'm afraid I didn't catch, something about fluidity. The line went a little funny.
Yeah, fine. We can discuss.
Okay, so leaving it at that. I'm interested in what Mahadev was talking about in terms of subjectivities and new subjectivities as well. I was just a bit, I don't know, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Can I throw one back to Mahadev? Great. I made some notes and it was just really interesting listening to it. I had a question though, a sort of thought that sprang up, which was that in order for capitalism to take said to be fully, I don't know, take hold in a society, it's the subjectivities. I think that's you know, only when it has sort of infiltrated at the level of subjectivities that you can sort of claim that society has become capitalist in its entirety. But I was wondering whether that assumes that social relations are prefigured and prefixed, that we would say, here is the capitalist subjectivity, here it is on display. Now we might begin to say capitalism has taken taken hold. But if that be the case, how does one recognize it? Does it collapse into an old sense of we have all, you know, become as atomized as in the West, for example, and in a crude sense, or we've all become consumers and consumerist culture has taken over, and hence now a capitalist subjectivity is at play? How does one recognize capitalist subjectivity? Is there already a prefigured one in the West? And so if the Indian subjectivity or the subjectivity in this new cinema begins to look like that, we might now point to it and say, here we go, here is that capitalist subjectivity on full sort of display. So Mahadev, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as a mild challenge.
Yeah, I mean, there is a degree in another paper I wrote on this same field of objects. I have looked at the history of this new cinema in terms of one characteristic, which is a tendency to a different imitation, which is learning by imitating, which you can almost compare it to, young artists sitting in museums and copying masterworks, as a practice, which is part of a training, And you see a number of films which are of this kind. And I think another point there is that that there is a certain collapse of representational distance here, which was characteristic of new cinema in the 70s and even some of the mainstream commercial cinema, which is that there is a first of all an investment of the filmmaker in a certain kind of learning to be a new subject, and the film itself then reflects that desire as much as it does tell a story. I mean, these are things I wish I could illustrate, but this is what I have in mind. That and indeed, I would say that capitalist subjectivity is not something wholesale, ready-made. There's not a model that you can replicate, but there is a structural dimension that can be can reproduce itself given all the other institutional and discursive sort of things being in place. How that then evolves into, does it become the same? I mean, there was this old question of cultural imperialism, where the idea was that you become like somebody. That's, that is in the context of what was considered an imposition of American culture on the rest of the world. But here it is a kind of subjective, self-fashioning kind of activity, in which imitation operates as a way of learning. And imitation, not necessarily one cinema, but, there is a lot of, there's been a lot of effort put into genre filmmaking, learning to make genre films. There's been a lot of effort put into other kinds of, Korean cinema and its aesthetics and so on, learning, all that. So, and you can see that there's the script writing, sort of the enthusiasm for script writing is something of a phenomenon in India. Workshops are held all over the place, and people flock to these workshops to learn about things and so on. And so it is. I mean, at the heart of it, I imagine is both combination of learning from the globalized, in a globalized situation, learning from other parts of the country, other parts of the world, which has become easier now through digital technologies and so on, as well as transformation in, a lot of filmmakers nowadays, they have experience of having been, code writers and other kinds of engineering and other jobs and so on. So I believe, that's why I, put that whole commodification of labor as a crucial issue at the heart of it. So these are, these are, I guess it's just a phenomenology of this process. It's that one is sort of developing, accumulating evidence for it. And the cinema definitely shows a new kind of sensitivity to the question of whose body is it, in a way that you've never seen it before. I mean, a film like Thappad, is inconceivable. Thappad is middle class sort of sense of the inviolability of the body and so on, which is there in Queen and other Masan and other films also. And the Great Indian Kitchen and people like that, where bodily this drudgery versus labor of a different kind, freedom, etc. Questions which have a global sort of have debates, have been sort of the subject of global debates and so on. So whether by this kind of structural transformation and subjective modifications of subjective dispositions, or through the learning from this influx of global culture, and so on, through a number of processes. I believe they are part of the whole, they're all part of this thing. So the filmmaker's desire in this case is itself a desire for transformation of the same kind. And that's the crucial thing in a number of these films. But of course, there are other things like genre filmmaking, Yash Raj films also trying to get into the act and doing certain, but that's also part of it. And you can see that even the mainstream commercial cinema has been undergoing a lot of, convulsions, changes of its own, responding to the, you could say that there is a lot of social limitation that was, in the content of these Karan Johar, Aditya Chopra films. Whereas here, it's actually aesthetic, at the level of aesthetic representation, discourses, that there is an imitation of learning by doing, learning by imitating, and so on. I mean, this is, I know, this is something that is generally not approved of in, to say in public that, Indians learn by aping the West and so on. There is a certain protocol that prohibits that kind of discourse. But I think it's when you see it around you, I think Indian cinema, for instance, has never had this kind of problem about learning from others that the post-colonials tend to have. So anyway, that's my answer.
But I think in the work that I'm doing, I think that's interesting. In the work that I'm doing, I think there's a sort of narrative that still, for me, one of the things that I would do with my students is a notion of that cinema is always already global, that there is a narrative around cinema that sort of too much kind of linearizes it, or somehow sort of it, emerges in the West and then off it goes, sort of traveling. And while that is to some extent true in terms of the inception, if you will, it has always already been global. There is this, and that is the re-narrativization, I think, of cinema. So I think it wouldn't be so much simply a case of aping, and I would be, I mean, I think there is this orthodoxy, a new orthodoxy that sort of says, you know, avoid this. This is, you know, about hybridity and glocal and et cetera. But I think I just, it might be just a touch too harsh. I don't know. I don't know whether I'm mishearing you or misunderstanding, but it just seems perhaps it's not simply reversing to aping or you know,
not aping. I'm not saying aping. I think imitation is not necessarily aping in the sense of these are very serious projects of learning to do that kind of film. You know, Zinda is an example, and this dinner game, you know, Beta Fry. There are a whole bunch of films. I mean, it's not that it's sustained, you know, for right through for 30 years. But there is a moment where you can see that there is a lot of people are doing this. Zinda, if you look at Zinda, I mean, you know, you can't think that Sanjay, what's his name, you know, actually thought that this film is going, you know, it's like its commercial possibilities. I don't think would have, you know, sort of been very, you know, great for, you know, in anticipation, because it really doesn't. But there is a serious, like, you know, doing everything according to this how it is. And the fact that there was never such a cinema is what makes me think that that's a you know, that's what is going on. You know, this is the practice. It's a workshop kind of activity, if you like. You know. So it's not, you see, aping, for instance, in the old days, there were a number of films were lifted, and then they were camouflaged in the, you know, the existing Indian film aesthetic, which then, you know, you couldn't recognize it, really. I mean, you know, whether it is Andaz or the Parent Trap films, or, you know, it's constantly you used to have some of these films, but they were so totally, you know, with songs and everything and so on. They were not recognizable, except story structure. But this is a different kind of working with the originals, because they are of a different aesthetic quality. Now, you know, interestingly, in India, one of the things is, for instance, the age of melodrama. You know, we talk about the age of melodrama, and melodrama is a global aesthetic. There's absolutely, you know, it's everywhere. But the thing is that in India, that format subsisted, continued to be, you know, to function for a much longer time than anywhere else in the world. That's an interesting fact in itself, right? There's a mixed economy phase of Indian history. It sustains that. Now suddenly you see, you know, nobody does lip sync anymore except Salman Khan or Pawan Kalyan or some, you know, some of these big people. They don't do it. Even, you know, it's a minimal, and it's surely, you know, seems to be on its way out. So it's that's a, you know, an aspect of a new reality. Something is not possible anymore. You know, certain things have, you know, just wither away, as it were. You know, so you have, you know, just not time to understand this.
Yeah. So it would be actually quite interesting to leave the panel discussion there with the conversation between two panelists. And yeah, I think that discussion actually opened out questions which were hinted at and not fully opened out in the presentation themselves. But I think very quickly, to wind up as I'm supposed to, I think one of the things that we have left with us to think about is the question of the body and time as within the frame of the new films that are, say, 21st century, we would like to call it that. The idea of body in time is quite interesting and important, really, especially in a visual medium such as cinema, particularly in the context of the identity. And for example, I think Madhav ended with pointing to gender and caste as examples of how embodied identities, operate within filmic narrative. But visually speaking, the gendered body is not quite like a caste body, in the sense that a gendered body is although today it is difficult to argue that, but nevertheless, in terms of a popular imagination, the figure of the woman is not quite is distinguished by her body in a particular way. Whereas how does one actually think about caste? How does one do that? Skin color or what? So even if similarly, if you think about a Muslim body, what is there in the body itself that that is characterized as a Muslim, right? Particular gesture, particular clothes, location in a particular thing, a name. So, I mean, when you look at the body itself, the specific embodiment, there is I think there's a sense in which gender is not quite is not quite in the same boat as, for example, caste or community in that sense. So I feel perhaps one can think a little more about this. The idea of an aesthetic identity, the aesthetics of identity, to actually to look at the detailing that Syed talked about, whether those details, how do those details intersect with the body per se, in the body in time per se? Perhaps that's a question that we would need to think about a little more. So I think with that, we can bring this panel to a close. Very interesting, and it opens out different ways of thinking about contemporary cinema. And I thank all of you and for your questions, for your presentations, for the last conversation. And thank you, Dhananjay and Nutan, for putting this together. So with that, goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers and the chair. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, nice to be here.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a break until 6 p.m. So at 6 p.m. we meet again.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you to all the speakers and the chair. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, nice to be here.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.